So now that we've talked about what the own wage elasticity is and how you calculate it, now let's go and talk about what makes that own wage elasticity more or less elastic or inelastic. And in general, there are two different ways that would make something that would affect that. Now specifically, the own wage elasticity is going to be more elastic, it's going to have higher elasticity, right? Based on if the price elasticity of demand for the product is high, if there's highly elastic demand for the product, if other factors of production are easily substituted for labor, if the supply of other factors of production are high, okay, and if the cost of employing a category of labor is a large share of production. So let's talk about each of them. So two things to remember before we go forward are two terms, substitution and the scale effects. So the substitution effect says that as wage goes up, okay, labor becomes relatively more expensive than capital, and so you're going to have less labor and more capital. Right, so the substitution effect says, again, that as wage goes up, you have less labor because it's more expensive, so you're going to substitute some capital. And then the scale effect is about the product side of it, and the scale effect says that as the wage goes up, it becomes more expensive to produce, so the price of the good goes up, and the quantity of demand of the good goes down as it readjusts, and so because there's less units being sold, there's less demand for labor. So just keep those in mind. Oops. So let's start with the price elasticity of demand being high for the product. So why would that affect the own wage elasticity? Now this is going to go to the scale effect. Okay. So if we go over here and let's just say, all right, so we're going to look at the product demand. Yeah, let me take this off here. We're going to look at the product demand. And so you have the price of the good and the quantity. So this is the product that this labor is being used for, or that this labor is being used to produce. So from the scale effect, it says as wage goes up, it causes the price of the good goes up, so the quantity demand it goes down, and so there's a decrease in demand for labor. Okay. Well, what happens is if it's highly elastic. So let's say that it's highly elastic, so it looks something like this. Right. Well, in this case, and let's just say, so we have our supply. Okay. Well, what's going to happen is if the something happens that causes the wage to go up, and so if that happens, it becomes more expensive to produce, and if that's the case, then there's going to be some sort of adjustment. All right, so it's going to there's going to have a new supply curve, and what's going to happen is, I apologize for not having straight lines here. You're going to go from P1 to P2. But what happens is because it's a highly elastic demand curve, you're going to see Q1, Q2. A pretty large decrease in the quantity demanded of that product. And so what happens is if the demand of the product is high, it has a highly elastic demand, right, then there's going to be a larger scale effect there. And so it's going to be more elastic, the own wage elasticity demand, that is. So some implications of that, elasticity as a firm level will be higher than an industry or market level. That's because firm level has a lot of close substitutes than industry. Monopolists tend to be less elastic than perfect competition. And then wage elasticities tend to be higher in the long run than in the short run. And if you recall back to your prior courses, the reason why is that the longer the time frame, when you're looking at a product, the more elastic it becomes because there are more substitutes available for that good. So let's do this here. And let's go back to number 2. So 1, if the price elasticity demand for the product is high, right, then the own wage elasticity demand is going to be high. The second is that if the substitutability of other factors, all right, is high. So basically, if other factors of production are easily substituted for labor, so for example, if you can easily substitute capital for labor, so you can there's something that you can very, very easily go and say, all right, well, if I want to move from labor to capital, I can do that quickly and easily. Well, if that's the case, if they can be easily substituted for each other, then the own wage elasticity of demand is going to be high. And the reason why is that as wages rises, there'll be incentives to use these other types of inputs. And the easier it is to substitute labor, the more likely is that this substitution will take place. And so what's going to happen then is that when other factors of production are easily substituted for labor, then the substitution effect is going to be high in that case, and it's going to have a large decrease in the amount of labor. If the supply of other factors of production is high, all right, so if there's other factors out there that are used to produce, if that supply is high, then the own wage elasticity is going to be high. So as employers substitute, so for example, skilled labor for unskilled, then the cost of those other factors is going to increase because of the increase in demand. It's more likely in the short run. So if other factors are highly elastic, they can increase without substituting a large increase in the price. So what happens is the more elastic supply of a substitute, the more elastic demand for labor. Finally, the cost of employing the category labor is a large share of total cost of production. And basically, the larger the share, the larger the elasticity. So let's say that, over here. And so let's say that labor was 20% of the total cost. Well, if wage went up by 2%, sorry, wage went up by 10%, then what would happen is that the total cost would go up by 2%. And that 2% is going to come from the 20% of the total cost that wage currently is times that 10% increase, so 2%. So if that's a relatively small part. So when it's only 20%, the total cost is going to go up by 2%. And so what's going to happen there is that scale effect is going to be small. Let's say, on the other hand, that it's 80% of the total cost. Well, now if wage goes up by 10%, then the total cost, 80% times 10%, it's going to go up by 8%. So it's now going to be 8% more expensive to produce the good. And so when all that happens, right, you're going to have a larger scale effect. So when we look back here, so these are the 4 things that are going to make up the own wage elasticity demand more elastic. The first and the fourth, the price elasticity of demand for the product is high, and if the cost of employing the category of labor is a large share of the total cost, those both would cause large scale effects. The second and third, if the other factors of production are easily substituted for labor, and or the substitute of other factors of supply is high, then in that case, it's going to affect the substitution effect. Okay? And so these are both examples of what would affect these are all causes of what would affect the elasticity.